Hi everyone. Thank you all for making it on this evening. At least that's where I am. I'm seeing in the chat that people are coming in from all over the world, which is really exciting. Also shows that this topic is something that we all want to understand and hopefully all want to work to abolish as well. So I'm with the Decolonial Centre. We are a political education project. We focus on spreading education on colonialism, the legacies of colonialism, but also the continued existence of colonialism. And our aim also is to maybe, through the power of political education, inspire people to decolonial action. We've got a website which Izzy helpfully put in the chat. But we've also got Instagram. You can check us on Instagram, on the socials, on LinkedIn and watch the space because in the next few weeks, we're also really working on building up our media capacities. And there might be some opportunities available on that front as well. So yeah, follow us on mainly Insta, but you can also follow us on LinkedIn and make sure if you can go on our website, you will be able to join our newsletter where you'll be able to get all the news that of the work that we're doing. And with that, I will pass to Hannah and she can talk about their platform.
Hello, thanks, Mohammed. Yes, my name's Hannah. I'm the co-founder of Shado, and my other co-founder, Izzy, is also here. She's the one writing diligently in the chat. So Shado, we're an organization. We exist to disrupt, diversify, and decolonize the current arts and media landscape through amplifying the voices of people on the front line of social change and connecting individuals and organizations which might otherwise have been working separately. We really believe those with lived experience of an injustice or issue are best placed to advocate for meaningful change within that space. We're really driven by collaboration and connecting different fields to create greater impact. We're very big on reimagining current systems of marginalization and working together to create new ones. So cultural production is a massive part of what we do. So that's editorial work, we curate events, we facilitate workshops, and we build out the capacity of different grassroots and community organizations. We've got a radical book club, we've got a podcast, we've released a documentary, and we're currently on our second year of a mentorship program for unpublished writers who identify from communities which are traditionally gatekept from media opportunities. On the left, we obviously talk a lot about diversity of tactics, and I guess we take this approach to how we tackle social justice issues with all of these different streams of what we do at Shado. We really believe that all systems of oppression and therefore liberation are interlinked. There can be no gender justice without queer justice, without migrant justice, without climate justice, without disability justice, without a free Palestine, without energy justice. And so that is what brings us here. And yeah, again, thank you so much all for joining. And without further ado, I'm going to pass you on to Hamza, who you can either pin on the top of your screen, or as he shares his screen, I think it might take up the whole screen anyway. But yes, find a bit of housekeeping. And over to Hamza.
All right. First of all, I would like to thank Shado Magazine and the Decolonial Center for organizing this event, and welcome to you all. I'm really hoping that we're gonna have a good conversation today. So I'm gonna share many examples of what we call energy colonialism or energy neo-colonialism from various parts of the world, just to get us thinking about other examples, but also how we need to build alternatives. Do you see my screen? You see it, right?
Yes.
Cool. So just quick introductions. So my name is Hamza Hamouchene. I'm an Algerian researcher and activist. I'm based in London, and I work for the Transnational Institute, doing their North Africa and Arab region program. I work on various issues, including energy transition, extractivism, food sovereignty, and also other issues connected to these matters. So today I'm gonna, as I said, talk about specifically energy colonialism and energy neo-colonialism. But before I delve into some case studies and specific examples on how colonial and neo-colonial dynamics are reproduced or entrenched, I felt that it was important to start a little bit with a discussion on what we mean by colonialism and what is neo-colonialism, because not everyone is versed in the literature um, of these concepts and these frameworks, and then we take the conversation to the energy question, either fossil fuels or green and renewables. Okay. So I tried to look for a specific definition of colonialism, and I found this on the net, and I thought it's a decent definition. So I'm gonna read it out. Colonialism is the extension of a nation's sovereignty over territory beyond its borders by the establishment of either settler or exploitative colonies in which indigenous populations are directly ruled, displaced, or exterminated. Colonizing nations generally dominate the resources, labor, and markets of the colonial territory and may also impose social, cultural, religious, and linguistic structures on the indigenous population. So, in that respect, colonial domination in whatever form, that could be settler colonies, that could be military occupations, that could be protectorate, is a form of imperialism. And I put in this slide a picture of a very important book by Walter Rodney talking about the colonial dynamics in Africa and how colonialism and how European colonialism specifically, underdeveloped Africa. So the colonial era, we can say formally, is long gone, with some exceptions, of course, in terms of Palestine, Western Sahara, Kashmir, and other colonized lands, especially indigenous communities' land. But that era is gone because of a decolonization wave, because of the resistance of the colonized that expelled the former colonial powers from France to Britain to Italy, Germany, and so forth. And within that decolonization era, specifically in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, what we call the Third Worldism, the Bandung moment, the liberation moment, several countries engaged in ambitious industrial and agricultural development projects that achieved some important gains in health, in education, in employment, as well as the well-being of their people. But by the 70s and 80s, because of various reasons, including neo-colonial imperialist intervention, the context of the Cold War, and the hostility from the centers of empire, those experiences, decolonizing experiences, liberation experiences, or what some people call delinking experiences from the imperialist capitalist system, started to show their limitations. So those experiences, some of them, and let's say a lot of them, went directly into a neo-colonial phase, in a neo-colonial period. So I just wanted to give you also a definition of what is neo-colonialism. This is something that I've written in some of my articles. So it says like this: colonialism, if it ever formally ended, is continuing in other forms and at various levels, including in the economic sphere. This is what some scholars and activists call neocolonialism. So the economies of the peripheries or the global south have been placed in a subordinate position within a profoundly unjust global division of labor. On one hand, as providers of cheap natural resources and a reservoir of cheap labor, and in the other hand, as a market for industrialized high technology economies of the North. This situation has been imposed and shaped by colonialism, and attempts to break away from it have been defeated so far by the new tools of imperial subjugation. We have crippling debts, the religion of free trade, structural adjustment programs imposed by international financial institutions such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. So this is globally or generally what is meant by neo-colonialism. So by the 80s, especially what we call the onslaught or the neoliberal onslaught or the coming of the neoliberal phase or the neoliberal counter-revolution, the worldwide neoliberal wave crushed those experiences. And a new era has begun where we see comprador or submissive classes and local elites that want to be integrated with international capital. And it is within this period that we see a consolidation of neo-colonialism. So today, many countries, if not most countries of the global south, follow the dictates of the instruments of imperialism, such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization, that promote some instruments of plunder. The debt, conditional aid, money flight, tax avoidance, structural adjustment programs, unequal exchange, extractivism. And it is within this context that multinationals and other companies with a local capital acquired a greater role in the global economy by furthering their plunder of resources, exploitation of the working force, and destruction of environment and livelihoods. So I just wanted to start with this general introduction to what we mean exactly by colonialism and neo-colonialism. So when we move to the energy question, we can understand what we mean by colonial and neo-colonial dynamics. So in the energy sphere, I feel and I think that energy extractivism or extractivism in the energy sector is neo-colonialism, reproduces those neo-colonial relations. So what do I mean by extractivism? Extractivism is a mode of accumulation and appropriation that has been unleashed all over the planet since the 15th century with the European conquest of the Americas. And as you can imagine, that process has been shaped by violence, plunder, theft, exploitation, and slavery. And a similar process took place in other parts of the world, including in the Arab region, through European colonialism in the 19th century. Strictly speaking, extractivism refers to those activities which remove large quantities of natural resources that are not processed, so raw, or processed to a limited degree, especially for export to international market. And this is the dimension that creates the dependency and creates the plunder and the unequal exchange between the South and North. We see the drain of resources, the drain of wealth going from North to South. And extractivism is not just limited to energy sources like oil and gas. It is also present in mining. It is present in agribusiness, intensive industrial agriculture. It is also present in industrial tourism, massive tourism that consumes a lot of water and resources. I saw throughout my field visits to various sites of extractivism, either fossil fuels, mining, or agrobusiness, in the Arab regions, but also in other African regions, what some people call the development of underdevelopment or the accumulation by dispossession. So, on one hand, you see that those areas are rich in natural resources, but in the other hand, you see environmental destruction, prevalence of diseases, you see unemployment, you see lack of development. And this is the paradox of that capitalist, extractivist model of development, between quotation mark. I think it's much more accurate to say maldevelopment or de-development rather than development. And that paradox of extractivism creates what we call the sacrifice zones, where sacrificial people with their bodies, their health, their air, their water is being sacrificed in order to maintain the accumulation of capital. And the examples abound. From my home country, Algeria, Ain Saleh is one of the richest gas towns on the continent, but its local infrastructure is very poor. The only hospital that they've got, they call the hospital of death. And I said the examples are numerous, and I'm gonna go through some of them in my presentation. And finally, extractivism cannot be disentangled from the global war machinations and the militarist imperialist governance of the world. And in this respect, Iraq and Libya warrant more attention, as they have been the victims of the violence caused by fossil fuels and the Western fighter jets and bombs that go searching for their abundance. Let me zoom in a little bit on Iraq, for example. The story of Iraq, the story of the various wars against Iraq since the 90s, the sanctions, the regime sanctions in the 90s, is a story of destruction and death. Just the Iraq war in 2003 led to the death of around 1 million people, the displacement of millions more inside and outside the country, the sanctions, the regime sanctions imposed by the West, especially the US and Europe on Iraq, caused hundreds of thousands of deaths, including in children, because for lack of medications. But the occupation since 2003 till 2011 also left a huge environmental destruction. So around 5,000 tons of toxic waste, including radioactive depleted uranium. And the amount of radioactive contamination exceeds the contamination caused by Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. And you can imagine the impacts in terms of health, in terms of environment, and so forth. But at the same time, Western imperialist interests were also eyeing the vast oil and oil reserves in Iraq. So there have been attempts at privatizing Iraq oil and giving the lion's share to British and American companies. This is basically energy colonialism. Let's move a little bit to another example, specifically in North Africa, where I come from, and in this case, Algeria. And I've been studying how Europe, specifically the European Union policy, economic, foreign, and energy policy towards North Africa. And it is a policy that aims to lock North African energy sources into the European grid and is heavily influenced by arms and corporate interest. The priority has been always European energy security and interests, always. It's about safeguarding European energy security and perhaps getting more renewable energy from the region in order to reach their climate targets. I'm going to talk about that a bit later, but let's just focus on Algeria for now. Algeria is a country that is rich in fossil fuels, specifically gas. As of 2024, especially after the war in Ukraine, Algeria is the second largest source of gas imports to the European Union, accounting for around 20% of gas imports in gaseous states coming through pipelines directly as gas, and the third largest source of liquefied gas, what we call LNG, liquefied natural gas, that is shipped through boats and ships. So Algeria is very important in that regard to European to the EU energy security, and it has a very good infrastructure. It has 3 pipelines connecting it to Europe. It has ports with ships that can ship, liquefied natural gas. But at the same time, it is ruled by a rentier, corrupt military dictatorship that perpetuates Algeria's dependency on fossil fuels. And through my analysis and research around social movements in Algeria, I can say that the uprisings and social movements that the Algerian Sahara deserts, where most of the fossil fuel come from, that we witnessed in the last decade, from the anti-fracking movement, from the unemployed movement, but also for the most recent uprising, which is a national uprising in 2019, can be seen as an insurrection by the victims of fossil capitalism, of extractivism, and its logic of developing underdevelopment and accumulating capital by dispossessing communities. And let me focus a little bit on shale gas in Algeria, because I studied this and I did field work back in 2014 and 2015. Algeria witnessed a huge anti-fracking, which is anti-shale gas, uprising and protests. Tens of thousands of people, men, women, young, old, students, every social background in the Sahara rising against the exploitation of shale gas because they saw it as another threat to their environment, to their water, and also a kind of an entrenchment of the socio-economic exclusion that these communities in the Algerian desert have been facing for decades. But the story here is also a story about energy colonialism and environmental racism, because France banned fracking or the exploration of shale gas and shale oil in its own territory. But it provided at the time, in 2013, 2014, Total, the French multinational, with diplomatic support to go and frack in Algeria, its former colony. So if this is not energy colonialism and environmental racism, I don't know what it is. Already in the 90s, Algeria saw a dirty civil war. We call it the Black Decade, where more than 200,000 people died and tens of thousands of people disappeared in a war, a fratricidal war that pitted the Algerian military dictatorship, the Algerian military, against the Islamists in the 90s. But the 90s was not just a story of civil war. It was also a story of forced economic liberalization and structural adjustment programs to open up the Algerian economy to foreign capital. It was also a story of scramble for oil, gas, and influence. The military coup in Algeria took place in 1992, and then a civil war started just 3 years at the height of the civil wars and the massacres. BP, the British company, finalized the contract worth $3 billion, giving it the right to exploit gas deposits in Ain Saleh, the town, the rich gas town that I mentioned earlier with the poor infrastructure, for the following 30 years. BP now sold all its assets to Eni, the Italian company. So yeah, it sold it like 2 years ago. And then a month later, in 1995, a French company also did a similar deal amounting to 1.5 billion. On February 1996, the American firm Arcus signed a contract for a joint venture to drill in the Rue del Bagel oil field. And in November 1996, a new pipeline supplying gas to the EU was opened, the Maghreb-Europe gas pipeline through Spain and Portugal. And all of this in the midst of a dirty civil war where Algerians were dying in the thousands, tens of thousands. So these companies and the EU had a clear interest in making sure that the repressive regime did not go under. And the EU favored its extractivist economic interests and acquiesced to the Algerian regime's dirty war of the 90s. And by continuing right now to push for long-term exports of gas in a context where the Algerian public is excluded from decision-making and benefits, and where those benefits are largely reserved for the regime elite, the EU is pursuing a gas grab, basically energy neocolonialism. And equally bloody and in an equally bloody and violent fashion, we saw a similar thing in Nigeria, where another Dutch-British company, Shell, caused huge devastation, environmental destruction, human rights abuses for decades. It is an ecocide where Shell was fueling violent conflict by, militarizing society, by funding militia groups, and by, killing and assassinating environmental and human rights activists. And I just wanted to to put some quotes from those activists that have been actually executed by the Nigerian government with the complicity of Shell. So Ken Saro-Wiwa is one of those leaders. He said the Ogoni, which is the Nigerian ethnicity that has faced huge devastation from Shell, have been gradually ground to dust by the combined effort of the national oil company, Shell Petroleum Development Company, the murderous ethnic majority in Nigeria, and the country's military dictatorships. And another Ogoni leader said in 1993, "We have woken up to find our lands devastated by agents of death called oil companies. Our atmosphere has been totally polluted, our lands degraded, our waters contaminated, our trees poisoned, so much so that our flora and fauna have virtually disappeared." Many examples. Tunisia, for example. Tunisia is not a big fossil fuel producer, but it has some gas resources. Revolution took place in Tunisia in 2011. That's the start of the Arab uprisings. There was even a new constitution that stipulates state sovereignty over natural resources and transparency in related contracts. But when you look at the biggest company in fossil fuel company, which is Shell right now, it owns the largest gas field, which is the largest gas producer, called Miskar, and it holds 100% interest in that field, which is, as I said, the most productive in the country. On top of that, I think this is an important detail that people, I don't think it's a detail, it's a huge. It sells the gas to the national state electricity and gas company in Tunisia at international market values and in hard currency, as if Tunisian gas is being imported from abroad. So where is the sovereignty of our natural resources? This is neocolonialism. So just to summarize a little bit some of those examples. So the West's aggressive attempts to grab more Algerian, Iraqi, Libyan, Nigerian, and to a lesser extent Tunisian fossil fuels, while ignoring the people's will and grievances and preoccupation for their water and environment, could be qualified as energy colonialism, especially in a context where the EU is further pushing for more liberalization and privatization in the energy sector. Other examples, clear examples of, so if some of those examples that I mentioned now could be, let's say, more accurately described as fossil fuel energy neocolonialism or energy grabs or extractivism, fossil fuel extractivism, what take place on occupied land, like in Palestine, like in Western Sahara, occupied by the Moroccan monarchy, in terms of fossil fuel projects, we can call them energy colonialism. This is the case in the East Med, in the Eastern Mediterranean, where Israel discovered huge gas field in the Mediterranean Sea, some of them called Leviathan, Tamar, and Israel is also contesting other fields like the Karish, which should be a Lebanese a gas field, but these resources are the resources of Palestinians. They're not the resources of Israel. And Israel is using it to strengthen itself economically, to create dependencies with other countries, while letting people go without electricity, while committing a genocide. And just in the first few weeks of the genocide, the ongoing genocidal war, Israel granted new licenses to various fossil fuel companies, including Western companies and Israeli companies, to explore for more gas in the East Med. And the same story in occupied Morocco, where also Israeli companies are involved in the plunder of these resources and the entrenchment of colonial dynamics. So now I'm gonna move to the second part of the talk. So in the previous slides, I focused mainly on fossil fuels, gas, oil, but now I'm gonna move to demonstrate that those, let's say, extractivist, grubbing, neo-colonial, and colonial dynamics are also being reproduced in the field of renewable energy, in the field of what is called the green economy. So let me start with the colonial environmental narrative that has been developed since colonial times in the 19th century, where we see this Euro-British imaginary of, let's say, the desert in the Arab region, or the environment of the Arab people as alien, degraded, needing the contribution or the intervention of the white man, like the civilizing mission. Some thinkers, like Diana Davis, call this environmental Orientalism. And one iteration of this colonial Orientalist environmental narrative that we see today is the representation of the Sahara, the desert, in the Arab region and other parts of the world as this vast, empty land, the terra nullius, imaginary and conception. Vast, empty land, sparsely populated, representing an El Dorado of renewable energy and an opportunity for Europe to get its cheap green electricity while it continues its energy intensive production and consumption pattern. Obviously, this narrative is deceptive because, first of all, it does not take into account questions of sovereignty and property, basically, who owns those resources, who owns those lands, and who gets to decide, but also that narrative masks the ongoing colonial and neo-colonial relationships between the richest countries and the poorest countries. And this end up reproducing the neo-colonial dynamics, but also excluding local communities and workers from important decisions when it comes to their economic systems, energy systems, food systems, water systems, and so forth. And a lot of us call these dynamics green colonialism or green neo-colonialism. So what is meant by green colonialism? Basically is the extension of the colonial relations of plunder, theft, exploitation, as well as the dehumanization of the other to the so-called green era, the era of renewable energy, the era of the green economy. And this happens always, like similar to fossil capitalism, similar to mining capitalism, it happens by externalizing the health, socio-environmental costs from one part of the world, which are the cores of the empire or the centers of empire, the global north in general terms, to another part of the world, which are the peripheries of this world, the poorest, or let's say the impoverished areas, or the global south, what we call generally the global south. So basically, you have the environmental, energy, and water priority of one area of the world, the cores of the empire, the centers of the empire, coming at the expense of those priorities in the peripheries. And if we talk about the energy transition in general terms, I don't believe that we are seeing a transition per se, because we are seeing fossil capital and green capital intermeshing with each other. We are seeing the expansion of fossil fuels, but also investment in renewables. Renewable energies are not really displacing fossil fuel per se. So it's more of an energy expansion and energy addition rather than an energy transition. But even if we accept, let's say, that there is an energy transition, that energy transition, let's say the capitalist mainstream energy transition that the global ruling classes are promoting, is predicated on more extractivism. So for you to build the solar panels, the wind farms, the electrical batteries for the electrical vehicles, you need basic and rare minerals and metals, from cobalt, from nickel, copper, lithium, graphite, and many other what we call critical raw minerals or strategic raw minerals that are needed for this kind of transition. The question that we need to ask, where would these resources come from? These resources would come from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where there is a brutal and murderous war taking place, where children are being exploited in those mines. So some of us can have those kind of technologies. It would come from the lithium triangle in Latin America, which is Argentina, Bolivia, and Peru. Where indigenous communities' lands would be destroyed and their waters would be taken away from countries like Indonesia, from Zambia. And in these countries, as I said, extractivism, or let's say green extractivism, would be entrenched, and also the exploitation of workers. So we need to be aware of these dynamics. Let's go to specific examples from the region that I know best, which is North Africa and the Arab region. So I studied this big solar plant, which is one of the biggest solar plants in the world, called the Ouarzazate solar plant. It's in southeast Morocco. It has been launched in 2016, just ahead of the climate talks then, that have been held in Marrakesh. At the time, it was described as the biggest solar plant in the world, and the Moroccan monarchy was praised for its doing its bit for the environment and moving the path of down the path of renewable energies. But a little scratch under the surface would reveal a bleak picture. First of all, the 3,000 hectares where the solar plant was built have been taken away from the local pastoralist communities that have been using that land for centuries to graze their animals without a proper consultation process. Basically, what they did, the monarchy did, they took a few corrupt representative of the communities, 2 or 3 people. They took them to a 5-star hotel. They presented the project to them, and they told them this is the king's project, so you need to accept. So people did not know about it. This is basically a land grab, or what some people called a green grab. Then we go to the ownership of the project. Is it owned by Moroccans? No. The project actually is what some people call, or what is being called, put out there as private-public partnership, PPPs. When you hear it, it sounds beautiful. What's wrong in a partnership between the public and private sector? But in reality, public-private partnerships are a euphemism for the privatization of profits and the socialization of losses. Privatization of profits, so the private companies that are running this project, which are foreign companies, Saudi company, which is the first one is Aqua Power, Saudi company, with a consortium of Spanish companies, with some private Moroccan capital. They have their profits guaranteed, whatever happens with the project, guaranteed. This is what we call de-risking strategies for capital. Capital does not take a lot of risks, so governments or states come with guarantees. So what the Moroccan monarchy, the Moroccan government did is that they contracted around $9 billion of debt from various banks, including the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and other European banks with guarantees. So if the project loses, it's not these private companies who would be losing, but it's the Moroccan citizens who would be paying. In fact, the project has been losing money since 2016 to the scale of 80 million euros a year, and it is pocketed by the Moroccan government, which means it's the Moroccan citizens that pay for this. And Morocco is a hugely indebted country, a huge inequality, huge poverty. So this is not a just project. And then even when we look at the environmental credentials of such projects, so this solar plant necessitates an extensive use of water. That water was being diverted from the nearby dam. I visited 3 times, and actually that dam has dried up. Because of the use of the water by the solar plant, but also because of the impacts of climate change, the drought in the region. So even by looking at the environmental credential, I think it's questionable to call such projects green because they are creating more problems for the local populations. And the local population have been protesting against such projects. They've been repressed and they really not benefiting in terms of getting direct jobs into these projects. These projects are capital intensive. They create jobs only in the construction phase. And then it's just, engineers and technicians that comes from outside the area. And the other dynamic that international financial institutions, Western capitals, international development agencies like the German corporation GIZ are pushing or encouraging in the region is the privatization and liberalization of the energy sector with an export orientation. And I've studied and I looked at many examples from North Africa in terms of exporting green and renewable energy to Europe. One of them is Tunur in Tunisia. The other one is X-Links, which is, I think, much more closer to where I live, which is the UK. So I'll focus on X-Links. X-Links is a project proposed by the ex-CEO of Tesco. It is a big market here in partnership with the Saudi company Aqua Power and other companies. And it plans for now to build big solar plants and wind farms in southern Morocco. Also build an undersea cable, 3,800 kilometers cable that will bring green electricity to Devon, to the UK, to feed the homes of around 8 million people. At first, I did not believe that this project is going to take place because the costs are astronomical, and even in terms of technically and logistically is so huge. But I saw it in the UK energy security strategy, and the energy minister 2 years ago made also a declaration for the Financial Times that they are considering it. Till now, it is not implemented. I think there are some negotiations on who's gonna put the money, but you may ask, what is wrong with such a project? It's good that we share our deserts and Saharas and green electricity with everybody. The question is, Morocco itself, 80% of its electricity is generated from imported fossil fuels, from imported coal and gas. So doesn't it makes more sense to build such projects to green the grid in Morocco, but also to have much more self-sufficiency in terms of producing green electricity. The situation is much worse in Tunisia because Tunisia depends on Algeria. By 60% of its electricity comes from imported Algerian gas, and Algeria also provides it with an additional 11% of electricity. And we see these kind of projects to Noor and wanting to export energy to Europe. And I think these are the usual colonial schemes and the creation of green sacrifice zones. So it's okay to maintain the unlimited or the unrestricted flow of cheap natural resources, including green electricity, in this case, from the south to the north, while Fortress Europe continues building war and militarizing, its borders and killing people in the Mediterranean. The same story in green hydrogen. I don't have a lot of time to go into this, but green hydrogen is this magical bullet being promoted as a magical bullet to replace gas. It needs a lot of land. It needs also water. But where would, Western capital go to produce green hydrogen so Western capitals or countries like Germany would reach their climate targets? Of course, they go always to countries in the south, to Morocco, to Tunisia, to Namibia, to South Africa, to even countries in Latin America where land is available, as they say. And yeah, they're gonna use the resources, the local resources, the water that should be going into production of drinking water and feeding the local agriculture. But we are seeing like a lopsided logic. This is what we call neo-colonialism. I don't have a lot of time left, so I have just 3 minutes. So I just wanted to focus a little bit on Palestine at the end in terms of green colonialism. As I said earlier, when I was talking about fossil fuels, what takes place on colonized and occupied land can be called outright colonialism. And there are many projects, renewable projects taking place on occupied land in the Arab region, for example, from Western Sahara to the Golan Heights, the Syrian Golan Heights, and to Palestine, because these projects are taking place on occupied land. They are taking place in spite of the rights, the indigenous people rights for self-determination and liberation, and it is plundering their territories and creating, more dependencies, colonial dependencies. Western Sahara, the same. But Palestine, it is happening in a much more bloody, murderous, and genocidal way. Israel also used that Orientalist colonial environmental narrative, portrayed Palestine pre-1948 as an empty, parched desert, which has become a blooming oasis after the establishment of the State of Israel. And this is obviously a racist and environmental narrative presenting, the indigenous communities as ecological savages and using trees through conservation projects, like the Jewish National Fund have been doing for decades, as a colonial weapon. And there are other practices like water apartheid, and all of these practices trying to make Israel present itself as this green champion or environmental steward in terms of desalination projects, building renewable projects, planting trees, and so forth. It is greenwashing settler colonialism because it helps Israel to cover up its land theft, war crimes against the Palestinian people by posing, as I said, as an environmental steward and a green advanced country. And in the book that I co-edited, Dismantling Green Colonialism, Energy and Climate Justice in the Arab Region, Manal Shqayr went into some of the new practices in terms of renewable energy, looked at various deals that are taking place in the Arab region, and she showed how this normalization, including in the renewable energy sector, we could call it eco-normalization, creates new dependencies between, the Zionist state of Israel with the Arab regions, with the Arab countries around it. And this is not just a pure exercise of greenwashing colonialism. It is greenwashing colonialism, of course, but I think it's much more fundamental than this. It is about inserting Israel into the regional economy from a dominant position, including in the energy and renewable energy sector, and creating dependencies. So, for example, Jordan, Egypt, and other countries, their energy security, their food security, their water security becomes much more important than the Palestinian cause. And I can give an example, a specific example, which is prosperity blue and green, which is halted for now since the start of the genocide, but it was on the table, which is a deal between Jordan and Israel with the intermediation of the Emirates. So it has two legs. Prosperity blue means Israel would build desalination plants on the Mediterranean and provide desalinated water to parched Jordan facing the impact of climate crisis, but not mentioning that Israel has been stealing and plundering Arab water for decades, including from Jordan, Syria, and Palestinians. And then the other leg is green prosperity. So the Emirates would build a big solar plants through its company Masdar on Jordanian land, where the whole generated green electricity goes to Israel. So you may say, yeah, it's a win-win situation, but then it masks what Israel has done in the past in terms of, stealing the water and continuing to dominate most of the water in the region, but also hides the other dependencies. So Jordan gets Israeli gas, like it signed a deal in the last few years for a $10 billion deal to get gas from the Leviathan field for over 50 years. And actually, this has been contested by Jordanian people themselves. They were not happy at all. They were protesting in the streets. They said, this is treason. We are dealing with the enemy. We are creating dependencies on the enemy, and that's not fine. So instead of building that solar plant that the Emiratis are building, so you generate your own electricity. So you reach some kind of self-sufficiency while greening your grid. What you're doing, you're sending all the electricity to Israel and continuing to getting gas from it. You see the kind of colonial and neo-colonial dynamics in the region. And I will promise finish by this because I think it's really important. I made this argument many times repeatedly. It's really important to place Palestinian liberation in the global conversation around climate justice. Palestinian liberation is not simply a human rights or moral issue, but is fundamentally a struggle against US-led imperialism and also against global fossil capitalism. And I'll say why. So I'm not sure if you've seen what the Colombian president Gustavo Petro said at the climate talks in the Emirates in December 2003. He said, genocide and barbaric acts unleashed against the Palestinian people is what awaits those who are fleeing the south because of the climate crisis. What we see in Gaza is the rehearsal of the future. And I think he's absolutely right. The global ruling classes are willing to sacrifice millions of black and brown people as well as white working class people in order to maintain their profits, to maintain their domination. We've seen that repeatedly. We've seen that during the vaccine apartheid during COVID. We've seen that with the immigrants that are being killed and massacred in the Mediterranean. And we are seeing that now in terms of climate reparations that are not forthcoming from the richest countries in the north. I was in Azerbaijan last year for the climate summit. The richest countries are not willing to commit for the climate reparations needed by the most vulnerable nations on earth. Basically, humanity is being sacrificed. But why I'm saying that Palestine is fundamentally a struggle against US-led imperialism and global fossil capitalism. Because for a simple reason, US hegemony, imperialist hegemony in the Middle East is based on two key pillars. First of all, based on Israel as a Euro-American settler colony, which is a kind of an imperial advanced outpost helping to safeguard economic and geostrategic interests of the United States and its allies. The second pillar are the reactionary fossil fuel-rich Arab monarchies, from Saudi Arabia to Emirate to Qatar. The convergence of these two pillars through the normalization deals that we have been seeing, first of all with Egypt, Jordan back in the 70s and 90s, but then in 2020 under Trump there was a new wave of normalization, what is called the Abraham Accords, to bring these two poles together. Emirates normalized. We were expecting that Saudi Arabia would do the same before Hamas and Palestinian resistance disrupts all those plans. So, like from a political economy perspective, Palestine liberation, as I said, is not just a moral and a human rights issue. So we need always to center Palestinian liberation, because Palestine is not just the rehearsal of the future. There will be no global climate justice without the liberation of Palestine, without the end of all wars, and without the end of colonialism in all its forms. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Hamza. For folks who weren't at the top of the session, now we're going to have a 5-minute break where you can digest some of what Hamza has told us, grab a drink of water, do whatever you want, and we'll be back at 5 minutes past 8 for some Q&As. And I'm also going to pop some prompts in the chat. Yeah, go. I'll see you in 5 minutes. Hi everyone, welcome back. I hope you feel a little bit refreshed after that 5 minutes. So now we're going to open up the space for people to ask questions. I can already see that in the chat somebody has a question. Feel free just to put yourself off mute and ask away.
Hi everyone, you guys can hear me? This is Lamis. Yes, okay, thank you. So thank you everyone for this. This is very amazing. And thank you, Hamza, for all your work. I mean, I worked with Fortune 500 clients from several industries, specifically the energy, and I was specialist for the Middle East and Africa region. So I can definitely attest to what you're saying. as well as how different parties involved, not just companies or government, but also like the World Bank, the IFC, many other entities who are involved in this behavior. And it is evidently clear. And we have raised several concerns when it comes to also local communities protesting. So there is evidence of that. And we do see environmental regression as well. We do see the environment getting worse in some of these regions, or some of these people being uprooted to different locations. And I'm very excited about what you presented, because there's clearly so much evidence. But my inquisition here comes to, it's been really, really hard to see alternatives to what's been happening. And it's even harder to see local community provide different alternatives to get that support. But where have you seen there has been organizations in the field anywhere where they have tried to attempt different behavior, even should the funding come from these more, restrictive, let's say the funding has its own regulations, but at least some supportive body that comes with knowledge or experience is behaving differently? Where are you seeing some difference? Because it'll be definitely exciting, because ESG has been rising in companies, and it's something that I've been promoting to a lot of private companies on purpose to steer different behaviors differently. And definitely a lot of people might say colonialism needs to be uprooted, but sometimes that's difficult. So what are there in terms of organizations that that could help guide us experts to deal with companies and that redirect them towards something different? Thank you.
Should we take more questions, or Hannah, how do you want us to? I can answer question by question, or maybe have a few questions before, no?
I think question by question will work well.
Okay. All right. So what is to be done? The question of alternatives. Actually, I have many slides that I didn't go through in the presentation on alternatives, but I would say a few things. Because if we think about those questions just on, let's say, an individual basis, as individuals, the challenges become insurmountable, really huge, that we cannot deal on our own. So these questions always need to be thought through collectives, through social forces, through social movements. So then we can come up with alternatives and build alternatives collectively, because neoliberalism has fragmented us to the point, or atomized us to the point, that everyone is thinking on their own, and not thinking as a community, as a collective. And I think we need always, when we think about these problems and challenges, we think about them in this way. It makes it easier, a little bit easier, rather than just saying, okay, what am I going to do right now? We are seeing a genocide, we are seeing all these, destruction, environmental destruction, extractivism, colonialism, and so forth, and how we're going to deal with it. And then the second thing, I don't think there is a kind of a blueprint in terms of what is to be done, or the alternatives that we can implement everywhere exactly the same. I think it's really important, first of all, to have a good analysis, a solid diagnosis of what is happening, in terms, who owns what, who gets what, who wins, who loses, who decides. These questions are political economy questions. The moment you start asking those questions, you start reframing the problems in a different way, and imagining, another future. And I think that's the main problem that we have right now. Capitalism is telling us there is no alternatives, and you just need some reforms here and there, and that's it. But no, we need to have a structural analysis, realizing which are the forces we are pitted against, how capitalism works, how it reproduces itself, what are its weak points, where we can organize the various forces against it to stop it. And this needs to be within a general vision. We can call that different names. Some people call it just transition, others call it eco-socialism, some call it emancipatory futures, but we need to have certain principles that the local communities, the local workers in those areas where those projects are taking place need to be involved in the decision making. Not just involved, need to be at the heart of the decision making so they can embrace the project, shape those projects, so they can make for themselves and they can work for other people. I'm talking in general terms, and then I'm gonna give you some examples from the region that I've been working in. In terms of alternatives, I feel there are many people who are calling for certain specific things, certain demands, clear demands. I call them the 3Ds maybe. First of all, deprivatize and decommodify. We like energy cannot be a commodity, cannot be something that is being traded or profited from. Access to energy should be a human right, should be a common good, should be a public good. There are many campaigns all over the world, many efforts, many people resisting the privatization of their, economic energy systems and calling for deprivatization. And there are examples also in the Arab region. Specifically Tunisia, where there is a working group on energy democracy, which is a collective of trade unionists, but also environmental activists coming together to push against the privatization agenda of the energy and renewable energy sector, as well as against land grabs. So working with local communities to help them resist those big foreign owned and export oriented projects. So deprivatize, decommodify. So energy shouldn't be seen as a commodity. Democratize. And when I talk about democratization, I don't mean, liberal bourgeois election in the Western sense. It's about really democratizing the economic systems. So putting communities and workers deciding on how their resources are gonna be used and distributed, and how is that wealth is gonna be redistributed. This is democratization. It's not about elections every 4 and 5 years. And then the third D is decolonize. Decolonize, for me, involves many things. First of all, communities, workers, hopefully with their own progressive governments, wherever there is a progressive government, not everywhere there are progressive governments, coming together, rejecting foreign imposed agendas in terms of these export-oriented projects. Because if there is a political willingness and if there is a resistance from below, this is possible to reject such projects. And then it's also about breaking the dependencies. So, for example, in the green era, the so-called green era, there are possibilities for industrializations through green industrial policies to move up the value chain so you can challenge the subordinate insertion of your economy in the global markets. And there are examples here like Indonesia. Indonesia, whatever we think about the ruling classes there, whatever we think about the local development models in Indonesia, the ruling classes there, the governments dared to challenge some of that dependency imposed on them. They said, we have nickel. Actually, Indonesia is the biggest country with huge nickel reserves. Nickel is can be used in electrical batteries for the electrical vehicle chain. And basically, the governments there said, okay, I'm going to take advantage of that. Rather than me exporting nickel in its raw form, I'm going to process it inside, create more value, more manufacturing, more industries, and more jobs for my local economy. And I can move up a little bit up the ladder in the value chain. Of course, this comes with its own risks in terms of creating new dependencies, doing more environmental destruction, more workers' exploitation. There is no black and white in these things. So there is always negotiation of power, you need to maneuver in the global interstate system. You know what the European Union did when Indonesia dared to do this? They took them to the World Trade Organization to challenge that decision, basically telling them, how dare you industrialize? How dare you use your resources in a sovereign way? Saying, no, you need to export those resources in a raw form. So this is imperialism, this is colonialism. And this is not just happening with Indonesia. Many countries in the south right now, because we are moving into multipolar world, whatever we think, things are bleak when we see them, but the US empire is declining. And that's why it is reacting in a much more murderous and violent way. But we are seeing a move towards multipolarity, and that multipolarity has its own risks, of course. I'm not going to say that the new rising powers are beautiful, but also it creates some opportunities for nations, social movements, progressive forces in the global south to push for a sovereign and decolonizing agenda. And I think we should support these efforts. And maybe the fourth D is the degrowth movement. I feel I'm sympathetic to the degrowth movement in the North, especially in the richest amongst us in society. There are some sectors that need to be degrown for sure, especially the luxury consumption of the rich, some socially unnecessary production. But the degrowth in the North needs to happen also with the decolonization agenda in the South. In terms of groups, I mentioned in Tunisia, there are many, a huge trade union movement right now. We have a partner called Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, TUED. It's a coalition of hundreds of unions in the global south coming around an agenda of energy democracy, an agenda of energy as a public service, but also an agenda for challenging neo-colonial projects and centering workers and communities in this agenda. There are efforts here and there. I feel they're not enough. They are still scattered, but people are trying to work to push for their agenda.
Thank you for that. Really, really appreciated. I don't want to extend my question because I want to give room for other people. I just want to add one point. I completely agree with you. And my struggle is sort of the same. I'm from more of a business background. I try to push businesses to make better decisions and to enhance it. So I am working on some things where I take some of this learning and develop like a business case, you know what I mean, for businesses to see like a win-win scenario in behaving differently and moving differently. And that's, almost impossible to get the buy-in from, but I think is achievable. But that's my problem, that I see that if we don't accommodate businesses, then it's considered automatically a political thing. You know what I mean? That's the unfortunate thing when it comes to economics. And I'm not saying that we should benefit businesses. I don't want to do that. But businesses need to understand what they are made out of, which is the environment, which is the society. You know what I mean? And they need to behave with accordance to equal power for these things. So it is to find the fine line to help these unions to move towards better business. And this is the struggle that I'm seeing, at least, that I'm trying to do. Find this room in which I can move forward with. But I'm sure I will continue our conversation maybe in a different space, but thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Lamis, for sharing.
I have been sent a couple of questions in the chat, and so I can read a couple of them out. I'm mindful of the time, but the first one is someone is interested in knowing, Hamza, whether you have any inputs on geosynthetics for mining and their arguments on sustainability solutions as more protection to the land.
Geosynthetics and?
For geosynthetics for mining.
I don't know what's geosynthetics. Maybe that person can explain. We can learn together.
I will wait for them to get back to me. I also don't know what geosynthetics are, but there's also another question in the chat which asks whether you know of any solid sources investigating the Ben Gurion Canal proposed project running through the Gaza Strip. This, I believe, is something that was proposed first in the 60s, but now it's being given a bit more oxygen because of the genocidal proposal for kind of changing the Gaza Strip, I believe.
Yeah, on the Ben Gurion Canal, I forgot who. There is a Palestinian researcher. He's a political economist. I forgot his name. Um, if I remember him next time, I can share it with Hannah that, and they can share it with the whole group. But he was saying that this idea is being revived and could be one of the main motifs for the genocide. I'm not sure about those arguments that reduce the whole, settler colonial question to purely economic arguments like, or maybe energy questions or water questions. Of course, these elements are present and they are the bedrock of how colonialism and settler colonialism works. But yeah, we cannot just say, it's just about this canal. It's a settler colonial project that has been there for almost 100 years. Um, and it has a political motive, it has an ideology, it has also economic motives. So I think we need to place it in the larger picture. I think much more important than this canal is what is taking place in the East Med, those gas fields that I mentioned, because Israel is trying to become a kind of an energy hub in the region. Israel was not an energy power at all. It was importing its own energy. And with the discovery of the Leviathan and Tamar gas field, suddenly it became a big player in terms of gas, providing gas to Egypt, providing gas to Jordan. So right now, in the midst of the Ukraine war, what happens is Israel sends gas to Egypt. Egypt liquefies it because it has the facilities on the Mediterranean, and that Israeli gas is sent to Europe. Um, so one way of Europe to sever its ties with them with Putin. I didn't mention that earlier, but also it wants to play a more important role in terms of renewable energy. So its own companies, fossil fuels and renewable energies, are doing various deals in the region, from Morocco to Emirates to Qatar to Oman, in terms of building those renewable energy.
I have a definition of geosynthetic.
Amazing. Tell us.
Synthetic, so that is polymer-based materials engineered for geotechnical, environmental, and civil engineering applications. According to corporates, these materials improve stability, control erosion, manage water, and prevent contamination, critical for sustainable mining.
Okay, so if I understood it, I had a guess in my mind, but I wasn't sure. I wanted to just to make sure. If I get it right, it's a similar idea to more sustainable petrochemicals. So and these are synthesized in the lab from, let's say, sustainable sources, not coming from oil, not coming from petrochemicals. Again, I feel that we need to change the terms of the discussion. Capitalism always adapts. At first, it denied the whole climate crisis. That's what the fossil fuel industry has done. They spent decades denying it, even if they knew that it is happening, but they were funding various groups, lobbyists, politicians to deny the whole thing. When it has become not possible anymore, they shifted, their strategy to recognizing that there is a climate crisis, but setting the terms of what needs to be done to tackle the climate crisis. So instead of saying, let's keep, the oil and the gas in the ground, let's not invest more, let's not extract more, they are pushing for false solutions. And those false solutions can be market-based, like the carbon offsets, carbon trading, and all these solutions that have proven inefficient because CO2 emission kept rising every year. But also they propose a kind of techno-optimism. Like let's believe in technology development, in scientific development. Science and technology will resolve all our problems. We keep the status quo, things as they are. And, the same consumption, the same production, let's destroy the planet. But we can use science to help us. And we can use science, to solve the problem. Of course, science and technology will play a role. Definitely, we know that. But that blind belief, and I think it's a techno delusion, that science is gonna resolve everything. Like they are putting the carbon capture and sequestration technology. They are putting this idea even of having some sustainable chemicals without questioning the capitalist system, the capitalist mode of production. That is the heart, the cause of the climate crisis in the first place. If we don't shift the discussion, if we do not talk about capitalism, we are missing the point. Obviously, we are not going to overthrow capitalism overnight. So that's why we need to keep organizing, having a clear vision of what we want, building the necessary coalition to shift the balance of forces against capitalism. There is somebody who said it is becoming, I'm just paraphrasing, much more easier to imagine the end of humanity rather than the end of capitalism. I forgot who said it. Muhammad, do you know who said it?
Mark Fisher.
Yeah. So, but then capitalism is a historical system. It will end. It will collapse under its contradictions, but under the organizing forces, the resistance forces against it. And we've seen how colonialism, I always use that example in Algeria. French colonialism stayed 132 years in Algeria. It was a settler colony, one of the most brutal and violent settler colonies that you know. But we expelled them, but still the struggle for sovereignty is ongoing. It does not end at one point. Just I'm saying, capitalism is gonna end, and we need to have a conversation of capitalism if we want to shift things and build visionary and strong movements. Frederick Jameson, that's what I thought actually. Yeah.
I believe Mo has raised their hand, and I think this is going to have to be our last question, if that's okay, because I'm aware that we're already running a little bit over.
Yeah. Hello. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Hey, Hamza. Thanks for sharing your research and your knowledge. Kind of curious to hear more about yourself and the projects you're working on, and whether you have or work with artists and what you see the role of the so-called cultural sector in this wider project.
I must confess that I did not work a lot with cultural artists and cultural workers in terms of spoken word, painters, music, and film. We've done some kind of documentaries. I guess we can say cultural production on that front. And actually, I'm one of the co-producers of a web documentary series called Paradises of the Earth. Look it up. You can find it on the net. Looking at following a caravan of solidarity international caravan of solidarity to southern Tunisia, to sites of extractivism and environmental injustice. That was done in 2017, 2018. And it is in Arabic with English subtitles. But I agree. We need to fight capitalism at various fields and various levels, not just at the economic or political level, but also at the level of academic, cultural level. So all these terrain, I see them as terrain of struggle, because we need to shift the narrative. It's not just about material resistance. Material resistance is very important. That's what make things capitalism tremble, but it needs also a kind of cultural hegemony, change in the terms of the discussion, the framings that are being imposed to us. And this is an important work that needs to be done. This is ideological work, and the cultural institution, cultural artists, and cultural workers are key in that respect, in producing, audiovisual material, in producing, various forms. I would say I see it as a form of resistance and struggle, rather than just, letting the mainstream artists or the liberal capitalist artists frame the discussion for us.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mo.
That's, I think, quite impressive that we've basically managed to wrap up on time. I think the only thing left is to, say a huge thank you, Hamza, again, for sharing so much wisdom and knowledge. And we know that there was so much more you could even have gone into, which gives us the impetus, right, to keep learning. Thank you, everyone, for joining. And I hope, you all feel invigorated and ready for action after that. This has been recorded, as we know, and so everyone who's in attendance and folks who signed up but weren't in attendance is going to get emailed a link so you can rewatch it and digest it in your own time as well. But thank you very much, and we hope to see you at whatever next project we might do.
Thank you. Thank you all. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.